Hello, everyone. So my thesis is entitled The Burden of Memory, Pathologies of Post-Traumatic Pain and Disorder in the Writing of Caribbean Women. And it was inspired after reading Edward Stantikat's Breath, Eyes, Memory and Nicole Dennis Benn's Here Comes the Sun, both of which as a theme focuses on sexual violation, maternal relationships, and the transference of trauma between one generation of females to the next. But while reading these texts and other works by Caribbean women writers that share this common theme, I realized that, or I took from that there's a gap in terms of Bahamian literature that focuses on these themes. And so I needed a creative piece that's intended to fill that gap. And so my thesis is in two sections. One is the theoretical framework, and then the second is the creative piece, No Shadow of Turning. So as a theoretical framework, as an overarching kind of idea, Zora Neale Hurston talks about the Black women as being the mules of the world. And I wanted to really conceptualize what that means within the Caribbean space. And so as a post-colonial country, what does a Black female body look like, or what does it represent within these post-colonial spaces? And it still carries the legacy, as the theoretical background says, and the research that I did, it still carries that weight. It's still the site of untreated pain. The Black female body is still eroticized, it's still objectified, and is still valued based on sexuality and reproductive processes instead of that humanity. And that makes her vulnerable to sexual violations, even in a modern post-colonial society. And with this risk, what I've also noticed within the research is that there is an expectation or a culture of silence within the Caribbean space, where talks of sex becomes taboo, where we're trying to create among women, Black Bahamian women, this politics of respectability, where we try to defend and to resist the idea of being eroticized by going in the whole opposite direction. But this creates a vulnerability for girls, specifically considering that it is more likely for Black female girls to be violated sexually during their childhood than any other races of women. And so when there is this expectance of silence, she becomes more vulnerable to be re-victimized because she cannot disclose her experience is not legitimized in the same way. And given this context, given this silence, there are ways, or maladaptive ways, that Black women tend to cope. And one of those ways is avoidance, just not dealing with it absolutely at all. And this creates a pathology of behavior. This creates a vulnerability to certain issues like, drug abuse, depression, and all these other things. And so as an alternative method, considering that both Dennis Benn and Edward Stantikat have disclosed that their works are based on their own lives and the trauma that they have experienced, literature then becomes a means of intervention. And so as I thought about that, I wondered what that would look like in the Bahamian context. How would that play out? What would that pathology look like within the Bahamian context? And so my creative piece, No Shadow of Turning, is exactly that, designed to really tell the story of a poor Black woman within the Bahamian context, and her using with the tools that she has available. So those tools are our culture of religion, are the ways that we lean on our family, those kinds of things. And then also giving a voice to her pain in a literal way, in that she goes to a therapist, she unpacks the experience. And so she's able to separate herself from the trauma and create her own identity. So this is the culmination of what I believe that literature does within Bahamian Caribbean women writers. And the idea is that No Shadow of Turning would then become that physical representation of a Black female's voice within the Bahamian context. So that's my introduction.
Thanks, Sherilyn. All right, so I guess I'll start off here. Your narrative engages with Ben and Danticat, right? So Jamaican and Haitian writers. But I wondered if there were no Bahamian antecedents for you. Are there no Bahamian texts that deal with this kind of sexual trauma that you could have engaged with? Or that
So, yes. So as I've encountered, there is the artistic element or the artistic representation in Sonia Farmer's, and I can't remember the name of the writer, but the Red Thread Cycle, where you have the poem that talks about rape within the Bahamian context. It also physically, in the sense of the artwork, represents or gives a little bit of insight into the psyche of the woman as she goes through this trauma. So there is that. What I found lacking with that piece of work was that for a marginalized woman or a Baintown woman or a Grantstown woman who has not had the experience of high levels of education, her looking at that artwork, her being able to engage with that artwork may be limited because the language is not relatable to her. The way it's presented is not, it's at the National Art Gallery. It's someplace that she may not go. It's not someplace that she may think is for her. And so I really wanted to create a piece that represents that grassroots woman, that woman who has carried generations of sexual trauma, who may not necessarily relate to a poem, may not be able to dissect and deconstruct a poem in the same way, but is able to look at a narrative, be able to identify with landmarks that are actually in our setting, to be able to identify with the language, the dialect, the Creole that we speak, be able to identify and be able to see herself clearly. So yeah, there are works that exist, and I applaud those works. However, I just wanted to get really into the communities where I think are most vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Others?
Sherilyn, I enjoyed reading your piece very much. And yeah, very much enjoyed your explorations and the idea of, exploring the theoretical frame and seeing how your piece fits within a particular socio-cultural context, as you just described. And you talk about the issue of accessibility, because immediately I think of The Color of Rape by Liliwati Manu Rahming, and you're saying that you think the poem as an art form might be less accessible to the population that perhaps your work might reach. But I want to problematize that a little bit, in the sense that reading is, we're not a reading public.
True.
And so in what particular ways do you, you mentioned the Creole, the use of nation language, if you like, the Bahamian dialect, and so on within your work, which works very well, very effectively. And I wonder though, is there anything else that in your view makes your work more accessible to the very population whose experiences you emblematize within your work?
I think to the function of religion, the use of scripture. This is something that's a commonality, no matter where we fall academically. That's something that Bahamians typically can respond to. I haven't been able to really show you how that's going to play out, but there is a part of it where, well, you see at the beginning of each section, there is a scripture. There is something that pulls towards that biblical background. But there's also going to be a scenes where these people are in church and they're having that Pentecostal experience and things like that. So like, that's another aspect that is not really in the other works, not in Dennis Bent, not in Edward Stanticat, but is so unique to the Bahamian experience that it's relatable, I think, to everyone. And I try to stay away in terms of the narrative and how complex the writing is too. If I compare myself with, like, say, for example, outside of the Caribbean space, but Toni Morrison, whose language is more complex, I try to kind of stay within the simplistic kind of narrative that would allow for the average Bahamian to be able to understand. So there are several ways that I try to accomplish that, to try and allow for it to be accessible to who I believe I want, who I'd liked the target to be, the target market to be. So I would say really the allusions to religion, the use of simplistic language, and then the landmarks that are true to home. Mm-hmm. These are the ways I've tried to kind of become relatable.
Okay, thank you very much.